3 years of life.
How does a what? Say that again.
Because a baby is not held during the first 3 years
Right.
of life.
Right.
Might that be a reason that they later commit heinous murders?
Okay, so this is a little bit of a loaded question because you might be referring to someone in your life, and so I want to walk carefully. Okay.
No. I do realize that babies don't thrive if they're not
Right.
held. You
Right.
know, they're kind of abandoned.
Right.
Are these the same people who commit these heinous murders later in life, like to, you know,
Sure, mass shootings and this type of thing.
or worse?
So human beings are tendencies, our package of tendencies that we have. So in order to commit a murder like that, you have to have a proclivity for a tendency toward a propensity for that kind of criminal behavior. And not everybody has that. I'm not tempted to shoot people. It just doesn't even cross my mind. I'm the opposite. I take bugs outside. Like, it's just not who I am. And I'm not set up that way, but there are some people with more violent tendencies. So the thing that gives us our package of tendencies is we talk about nature and nurture. Is it nature? Is it nurture? It's both, but it's also choice. So the way I see it working is nature is your genetics, basically, what you were given through your DNA, passed down from your parents, and then the generations before them. And then nurture is your environment growing up, and that would be one of the factors in the environment. Was the baby held and nurtured and cherished as a child? And so that's a big factor in our package of tendencies. If a child is not held for 3 years of infancy, something else is going on in that home environment in addition to the lack of touch. So there's probably a whole sequelae of factors and a whole, just a bunch of things that are going on in that child's life that are working against healthy development. And then choice comes into the matter. When we choose to cooperate with those tendencies, we reinforce them in our own psyche, so to speak. So if I inherited the genetics of an alcoholic, I was raised in an alcoholic environment, and I learned the behaviors of alcoholism, and then I go ahead and drink alcohol, that's 3 hits. I'm reinforcing the inherited tendencies. So it takes a lot to get a person to a place where they're willing to engage in a mass shooting, but the lack of touch sure could be part of it. It's not going to be the only factor, but it could contribute. And it also, to me, signals a home environment that is probably very destructive overall. Because what person would not hold and cherish their baby? That's just, yeah, there's something going on there. So yeah, that's how I would say that. It's kind of a long answer, sorry. It's a whole seminar, yes.
Pertaining to children, I knew you'd do that. Pertaining to children, I had heard, you're saying like from 0 to 3, they're developing.
Mm-hmm.
I heard like children are pretty much set in stone by a certain age as to who they're going to be. Is that really scientifically proven? Or can a child who's been in an environment that is not conducive as to proper upbringing, can they be changed and undone of the negative upbringing?
Amen. That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Some people's upbringing is so deleterious. They've been surrounded with so much negativity and so many assaults and traumas upon their personhood. By the time they're 10, they're really deranged. Can that be undone? I would say it this way. I don't want to be naive. I don't want to fall into the ditch of denial that those things are really deeply harmful to a person's being, but I also don't want to fall into the ditch of despair, where I think there's nothing for that person and they're hopeless. So in most cases, there is the potential for change and growth, even though there have been these childhood hits, we call them. If you remember the comment I shared yesterday, the childhood isn't the end of the social brain story. I can't remember exactly how it's worded, but it's not the end of the story. It is part of the story, and that person's going to have a steeper climb. So what happens with a situation like you're describing is the normal person has this climb toward becoming a moral, loving, decent person. That person will have this climb. it'll just be a steeper climb, but it doesn't mean that change can't come. God has built resiliency into human beings in just a powerful way, and he has promised his Holy Spirit to engage with our human wills so that we can actually make huge changes. And I know people that had horrible hits, but I've also seen the pull. Like, I had a client once whose father sexually really raped him from the time he was 3. I mean, his childhood was the most horrific thing I've ever heard. And he himself developed his own issues. He came out of it for a period of time and was doing well and was really a very good person. But he relapsed. So it was easier for him to fall back. And there were some factors, some environmental factors. He ended up in jail, and just the way he was treated triggered, he went back. So there is more of a tendency, there's the default back to those old patterns. But people can change. I mean, what do we have to offer people if it's not that there's hope on the other side of a traumatic childhood?
Common sense would say common sense would say that if this child was in that negative environment and got put into a better, more Christian environment, it would be common sense to say, don't let that child be
put back in the old environment?
In contact with the old environment, because it would make it that much harder for that steep to grow.
Sometimes it's necessary to put a firm boundary up when there are abundant triggers in a given situation toward bad behavior, yes. But I don't want to get held to that in court, you know.
No.
But yeah, because I don't know the details of the situation, but yeah, there's sometimes a need to put up a firm boundary if you know something is very triggering.
Okay.
Yeah, very good, very powerful question. Yeah.
Last evening, you had cited some numbers regarding percentages of children outcomes relative to whether or not they come up through a traditional family or not.
Yeah.
So in having those conversations with other folks who are not from traditional families, arguing the merits of traditional versus non,
right.
Usually the next part of the conversation is, well, my data doesn't support that. So my question is, are you willing to share your data sources to
Sure,
achieve
of
those
course. I can't
numbers?
do it right now, but I would give you whatever I have. But let me say this too, that non-traditional families, that's not all that's going on in that home. It's not only that it's a non-traditional family. It is true that the trend is toward mother, father, children is the best configuration. The trend is toward better outcomes. That doesn't mean that there aren't some very bad outcomes from a traditional family. And that doesn't mean that all non-traditional families have a terrible outcome. I don't know why it's doing that, but because there are other things going on in that home. There's whether the parents are loving or not. There's whether the child is put in an appropriate educational context or not. There's nutrition. There's, the amount of media the child is exposed to and what he's exposed to. And there's so many factors that make that package of tendencies I was talking about that are beyond the traditional or untraditional configuration of the family. It's just that I'm here promoting something, and I'm just being honest about it because I think it was God's original design. I think it's ideal and it's going to encourage the best outcome, but there's a bunch of other factors involved in whether that child becomes healthy or not. Yeah, so yeah, just you can just email me or message me on social media and I'll give you what data sources I have, sure. Is this you?
Me.
Yeah.
You asked what impressed us most about last night. I was impressed by the fact that there seems to be for every physical reaction, there's a internal chemical reaction to it, and that goes for adults as well.
Yeah.
Because you were saying about the people in how it was the place in California where they do all the what's the valley where they do all the
Silicon Valley, yeah, they turn off their dopamine, yeah.
Yeah, they do not get involved with one another when they're working. They don't even look. You said they don't even look at one another because they'd be distracted.
Because they're trying to manipulate, they're brain hacking, so to speak. They're trying to manipulate their brain chemistry to increase certain brain functions. And so they're engaging in what I call the dopamine fast, or what they call a dopamine fast.
So that does, just looking at one another does cause a chemical reaction within.
That's right. And that's your point, I think, is that everything happens on this everything we experience behaviorally and psychologically happens on this neurological level as well. Yeah, we're multidimensional. as human beings. You know, there's
Amazing.
this physical realm we live in, there's a psychological aspect to human existence, and then there's the, you know, spiritual aspect, and it all kind of bleeds together. We're holistic. Everything connects to everything else.
Yeah, good morning. I too was impressed with that 3 years. You know, I thought it was like 7 years, but the 3-year impact on that child and
Yeah.
how you said something like we could tell them they're okay, like we're that security
Yeah,
that
they,
you're okay.
they learn how to self-regulate based on
Yes,
how well
yes,
they were regulated.
that's what
Yeah.
impressed me the most, that influence we have as a parent to
Yeah.
be able to give them that, you know. that's
Well, the
wonderful.
3-year window is a very important window, and then the 7-year window is the second very important window. So it's not either or really, it's both. There's like a continuum, but that 3 years is really telling. And then again, you don't give up. If you blew the first 3 years, you know, keep on it.
Right, because you
And-
even mentioned how that when they become teenagers all over again,
Yeah. They go back to right brain dominance.
Right, right.
Isn't that
And-
interesting?
yeah, and I know it seemed like during those teenage years, they're just, you know, all over the place. And that security that you can give them, that you're going to be okay, you're going to make it through this, you're
Yeah.
whatever, is so important.
Very important. Yeah, very good. Thank you for that. I appreciate that feedback. Anybody else want to share anything from last night that was meaningful to you, or any questions you have or comments? All right, we can get into our talk this morning. I think you're going to pull up my presentation. Like I promised, we're going to talk about love, sex, and marriage, guys. And don't worry, you don't need to hurry the children out of the room, although I don't see any of them, because when I talk about sexuality, again, I talk about brain chemicals, because it all happens in the brain. The biggest sex organ in your body is, guess what? Your brain. So I'm not going to talk about body parts so much as what happens in the brain, but I also want to address it from a spiritual standpoint. As I mentioned last night, we're working off of this life timeline, and the basic premise is this, that at every stage of human existence, we have the opportunity to build skills toward the ultimate goal of learning how to love and be loved. And so we looked last night at the first three stages, and we're going to look now at the spouse stage. We've seen that every respective relationship that appears pretty much chronologically in the life of a human being, mother-child, father-child, sibling, and then finally friendship, builds on the skills of the last. And now we're going to approach the most difficult relationship any of us will attempt, and that's marriage. I don't know if you found that to be true, but I know I have. I've been married 40 years. I've never attempted anything so difficult as being married. And we're going to look at that now. And we're going to talk about sexuality in the context of that because it is such a big part of it. If you think about it, marriage is really, in a sense, this is a crass expression, but friends with benefits, if you know what I mean. Because you really are very close friends with your spouse. At least you better be. Because if you don't have a friendship with your spouse, things aren't going to go well. So you're building on the skills you learned in friendship. And again, friendship is that first relationship you develop outside of the home of origin. It's your first chosen relationship. You choose your friends. You do not choose your siblings. You choose your friends. So it's the first relationship you approach outside of that family of origin. And you're building new skills. You have to be a lot nicer to friends than you have to be to your siblings. Your siblings are always going to be there. So you have to up your game a little bit when you choose friends and learn new skills. And once you refine those skills, then you're ready to attempt this most difficult relationship, that of a spouse. You know, I always ask people that are thinking about getting married, how have you done in the friendship department? If they don't have any friends and they don't know how to resolve conflict, that doesn't bode well for their eventual marriage, in my view. So let's look at some quotes from different individuals that have studied the impact of morality on society. This is a guy named J.D. Unwin, who back in the 1800s, this is long ago research, but he's just very well known as a guy who went in and looked at all of the civilizations that existed theretofore. And he assessed them for two things: their general cultural ascent, which means how developed that culture was, in comparison to moral restraints on sexuality, basically. Now, it's very interesting. He was not coming from a biblical perspective. He was a Freudian. But Freud didn't only believe stupid things. You know, he was kind of crazy in some ways, but he had a lot of value. He said first 3 years of life are very telling, and he was right about that. He also said that the more people restrain their sexuality, the more that culture will develop. So it was a Freudian concept that this man basically tested, and he did a massive amount of research. And here's a quote: "The cultural condition of a society rises in exact proportion as it imposes prenuptial and postnuptial restraints upon sexual opportunity." The more restraint, the more development. There is a perfect correlation between sexual fidelity and civilizational flourishing. Here's another man commenting on this type of research. He says, well over 90% of all sovereign nations in the world today declare recognition and protection of the family in their written constitutions. 90% of all sovereign nations, in other words, nations that have attained to a high level of autonomy and development, sovereign nations that aren't under, the control of other nations. These nations have developed a national strength and a power, and they have protected the family. So it strengthens a nation to protect the family. The family is the building blocks of any given society. It's the building blocks of a church. Your church really is only as strong morally and spiritually and socially as the families within your church. So there's really a very firm basis for protecting the family. As marriage becomes less respected and less valued, marriage rates drop. The timing of marriages is delayed, and the rate of non-marital births and child-rearing rises. Over time, that results in more children being raised in the difficult, disadvantaged circumstances of non-marital families. That also results in more unstable adult intimate relationships, more domestic violence, more family breakups, and more personal distress and suffering for adults, and especially who? For children. Again, the children are the litmus test. Is this working? Is it not? And so what we are seeing in our society today is marriage being respected less and less. And I shared some of those statistics with you last night. These are just some summaries here. Cohabitation is up, marriage is down. The more people agree to cohabitation, let's just live together. Let's road test our relationship. And a lot of the reason for that is convenience, finances, and a lot of the reason for sex before marriage is people want to figure out if the parts fit. But it's very interesting. As pertains to human genitalia, I told you I wasn't going to talk about body parts, but okay, I just broke my promise. But this is all I'll say about it. As pertains to human genitalia, it's kind of a one-size-fits-all situation. It's extremely rare for people to wait for marriage, end up in a marriage situation, an intimate situation, and be like, oh, this doesn't work. It really doesn't go that way. God has regulated things to make it so that just about every situation, and I'm not going to go into detail here, but the parts work, okay? So I just throw that in. So when cohabitation goes up, marriage goes down. The more denigrated or the less valued marriage and the less marriage happens in a given society, the more child poverty we see. The lower the valuing of marriage means increase in delay of marriage. Isn't that interesting? So we have more and more people marrying late in life, and I counsel many of them, and they have such a hard time getting married. They go through so much drama before they get to the place where, okay, let's just get married. And it's kind of ridiculous almost, because most people, if they have reasonable compatibility, and we're going to talk a little bit about that later, can work things out, once they're in a couple, if they have the right principles that they're, functioning by. But we're valuing marriage less and less, and then delaying marriage as a result. Moral laxity actually leads to less sex, if you can believe that. Now, I think part of what we have here is the proliferation of pornography. And so less people are having sex with other people. More people are having sex with images. But what we find is that moral laxity and less sex are actually correlated. So let's talk about porn for a minute here. Over $3,000 is spent on porn every second. I didn't say minute. I said second on the internet. Now, make note of the fact that this is this is purchased pornography. Do you know how much, anybody who's ever had a pop-up on their computer and typed in AAA or accidentally typed in XXX or something happened and all of a sudden, you know what it's like. There's tons of free stuff on the internet. This is purchased pornography. Over $3,000 a second being spent. And I'm not going to get into how much of that is child porn. It's rather distressing. And BDSM, which I won't even tell you what that means. 1 in 5 internet searches are for pornography. 1 in 5 youth, let's bring it home here, 1 in 5 youth pastors use pornography regularly, and I think almost all of them are my clients. I really had to get over my squeamishness when I got into counseling because I was approached by people in full-blown sexual addiction. And of course, most of them are men, not all, but most of them, and many of them pastors. Shocking. 1 in 7 senior pastors use pornography regularly. You know, the Lord tells us, let's read it together, drink water from your own cistern and running water from your own well. Should your fountains be dispersed abroad, streams of water in the streets, let them be only your own and not for strangers with you. So the imagery here is one of containment, is one of not dissipating out something that is precious. When you engage in sexual immorality, there's a loss of something that God wants you to cherish and to have for yourself and for the proper use. And it's very interesting to me that the New Testament word for immorality is dissipation. Isn't that interesting? All right, let's look at another proverb and let's read it together. Let your fountain be blessed and rejoice with the wife of your youth as a loving deer and a graceful doe. Let her breast satisfy you at all times and always be enraptured with her love. For why should you, my son, be enraptured with an immoral woman and be embraced in the arms of a seductress? All right, so when you look at the scriptures on sexuality, a cursory glance will make God seem like a real prude. Do you know that? I mean, if you were just coming to read the Bible for the first time and you weren't raised with all these values, and you're just like, I wonder what the Bible says about sex, you'd be pretty much, if you look on the surface, convinced that God is against sex. But nothing could be further from the truth. You see, sex is like fire. And fire is tremendously useful and ministers powerfully to life, doesn't it? If the sun was blotted from the sky, what would happen? We'd instantly die. We'd freeze to death. But even if that didn't happen, the sun grows our food and sustains us. In so many ways, fire in the form of the sun keeps us alive. But that same fire, allowed to rage outside of boundaries, ends up, instead of bringing life, bringing death. And that is why God has these strong restraints. This is where the boundary is, guys. Don't go beyond that boundary because I am trying to protect you. So it's kind of like this barbed wire, like those verses in the Bible that constrain human sexuality are saying, look, I'm trying to protect you here. Don't go beyond this point. And God is doing that out of love. I've had quite a few experiences in my life when I've come face to face with the power of fire. I've actually burned a house down accidentally when I was 12 years old. True story. My friend and I were smoking, and we dropped the cigarette in the couch, and it burned a hole, and we poured water and sprayed Glade, forgetting that Glade is highly flammable, and, long story short, left the house, and it burned down, burned to the ground. Well, it was a brick house, so it didn't burn to the ground, but it was completely destroyed. And I came face to face with the power of fire in that experience. Sex is like fire. It is powerful and needs to be kept within boundaries, but we should not conclude, because God is so adamant about those boundaries, that he himself doesn't like sex on some reason. For some reason, nothing could be further from the truth. Let's read this together. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word. This mystery is great, but I am speaking concerning Christ and the church. God uses the married relationship, including the sexuality component, to metaphorize the love of Christ for the truth, for the church. And I think if you look at this verse, honestly, it says he gave himself up for her. Physically, in the act of lovemaking, the man's body gives something up to the woman's body. We know that. And so this could be alluding to that. People get shocked. I've had people rebuke me on Facebook for saying that, just like, that's sinful, that's terrible. But I'm like, wait a minute, you have to assume that sex is somehow dirty to think that it can't be a metaphor for God's love for the church. Why are you reacting so strongly? Sex is a beautiful thing, and it's a sacred thing, and it's a godly thing within the boundaries that God has designed it for. That as soon as it goes outside those boundaries, it becomes something else. So it's the perversion of sexuality that is the problem and not sexuality itself. So let's look at what happens in the brain in sexual expression, sexual experience. And I'm just going to look at 2 brain chemicals because it's very complex. I'm going to boil it down, make it really simple. And I'm going to talk to you about how these 2 brain chemicals dance with each other in sexuality. One of them is dopamine. And as we've spoken before, dopamine is the neurotransmitter that mediates the experience of what? Pleasure, that's right. So it's also very bound up in the anticipation of pleasure, that feeling you have. You're about to eat something really delicious, and you've had that, I can't wait. Or Christmas morning, you're going to open all those presents, and you're like, anticipation, that's dopamine going on there. But also the experience of opening the presents and eating the food and sexuality. So that pleasure response is very dopamine involved. And then oxytocin is another chemical in the brain that is abundantly involved with sexuality, and it's a bonding hormone. So I want to look at how the 2 of these interact, because what happens is if one is experienced apart from the other, there is often, you're setting yourself up for addiction. So here's my premise, is that God designed sexuality to be experienced within a bonded, committed relationship. Now, it is true that if you have casual sex with someone, there is a bonding that goes on there, a biochemical bonding process. But you're not going to have the level of bonding that you would have in a secure, committed relationship. So what God is doing in limiting sex to marriage is creating the most secure and bonded context in which sexuality can be experienced. And he does it for a number of reasons, one of which is sex outside, the intense pleasure of sex outside of that bonded relationship sets people up for sexual addiction. I see it all the time. So what happens is there are various chemicals that take place in the brain. Let me forward here. This is Tim Clinton in a book called The God Attachment. He says the brain develops a tolerance for naturally occurring opiates. Notice opiates. What do we think of when we say opiate? Heroin, right? So, but we also look at this root word there, dopamine, opiate. You see the same word. Dopamine is your own inner heroin. And you may not realize this, but you can become an inner heroin junkie too. And that's what happens with sexual addiction. So the brain develops a tolerance for naturally occurring opiates. Though dopamine may be the hormone, pay attention carefully here, that creates the instinctive pleasure of love and attachment, it is oxytocin that makes it possible for that pleasure to last for longer periods of time. So the dopamine, apart from the oxytocin, is not going to be as pleasurable. The sex, apart from a bonded relationship, is not going to be as pleasurable. Now you tell me, is God pro-pleasure or is he against pleasure? Which one? He doesn't want less pleasure for you. He wants more pleasure for you. And so he has set up your very neurochemistry so that you experience a deeper and more profound pleasure in the context of a bonded relationship. But if you go outside of that, what happens is there's a deficit. There's a feeling of, I'm not getting what I wanted. I don't know if any of you are old enough, like I am, to remember the Stones song, I can't get no what? Satisfaction. There's just such a descriptive song. It just so well expresses what happens when in any arena we go outside God's boundaries and begin to experiment with sin. we're not going to be satisfied. God doesn't want us not satisfied. He wants us satisfied, which is why he creates those boundaries. So various changes take place in the brain. You go outside of God's boundaries and you start to engage in promiscuous sex or just pornography use and that type of thing. And you end up in addiction because changes take place in the brain. The synaptic gaps develop chemical changes that numb them out and make them less responsive. And then you need more of the same to be able to bring about the same response. And so people increase the amount, the supply of their addictive substance, and they end up in full-blown addiction. And it can happen with your own body processes. It doesn't have to be limited to a drug that is taken in from outside of your body. Let's look at one chemical here, and it's prolactin. You've just eaten a nice big Thanksgiving meal full of like high protein foods. You're going to have a high level of prolactin in your body. You've just nursed a baby. That baby has high levels of prolactin because of the milk, and you have high levels of prolactin because of the skin contact. Certain sexuality, you've just made love, and there's going to be a high level of prolactin in your body. But what they did was they studied the difference in prolactin levels between bonded sex and what they call solo sex, which is sex that happens with the person alone, not in the relationship. Prolactin levels, 400% higher in the bonded sex than they were in the solo sex. So that person had far higher levels of what? Remember the word from the Stones song? Higher levels of satisfaction. Mick Jagger should have tried this, you know. I mean, it's probably too late for him now, but he really should have tried it. So prolactin levels higher in that bonded relationship. Is God trying to keep us within boundaries? Is he making it easy as possible for us to do the right thing here? Is he not protective of us like a loving father? I can see it. You know, friends, I'll be honest with you. I wanted to go to seminary when I went back to graduate school, and my husband didn't want to be married to a pastor. I asked him, "You want to be married to a pastor?" No. So it's like being the last of the obedient wives, I decided not to go to seminary. So I went for counseling, and I was disappointed because I wanted to study the Bible. You know, I love the Bible, and I wanted to really dig down and study it on a deep level. But the Lord has used this study of science and human development powerfully, and I can read like scientific research like this and be brought to tears, worshiping at the feet of Jesus, you know, as I see the beauty of his plan. And so God makes it up to us. Let's read this together. You will show me the path of life. In your presence is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures for just a short time. No, forevermore. Does God want lasting pleasure for us? God wants more pleasure, not less. So this is research out of Brigham Young University. If you want to look for pro-family research, Brigham Young is a good place to find it. It's a large university run by who? That's right. And they're very pro-family. They really promote family life, and they have big families too. I had a very interesting experience. I flew, had a connection in Salt Lake City, and the guy that sat next to me was a Mormon, and he had a big family, and we had an amazing talk. He was a great guy, loved the Lord, and at one point he pulled a tile out of his backpack. He was on his way to Philadelphia. I lived at the time, and he was going to be building the Mormon temple in Philadelphia. I think it's built now. And he pulled the tile. He said, "This is the tile we're using for the temple." And at one point I said to him, "How much is it going to cost to build this temple?" And he goes, "Uh-huh." He wouldn't tell me because they don't let go of that information. But he was the greatest guy. And we talked, and we talked about the fact that Mormons are very, very family protective, and they produce a lot of research. So here's some of what they have said, that keeping sex within marriage, delaying sex until marriage, and then staying faithful to your spouse, all of those various aspects of God's plan for sexuality, is going to, generally speaking, produce better sex. Sex within marriage is rated 15% better, better marriage, higher stability rates, higher satisfaction, better communication. And then we know better health because we know about sexually transmitted diseases, and better mental health. We don't study that or talk about it enough, but I see it on a regular basis counseling people who have gone outside of God's plan and are dealing with the fallout of that. I can see how people get emotionally shattered by these experiences where they love and then they lose. God would like to protect us from that if he can. Did someone have their hand up? I don't want to like overtalk you here. Yeah. Brigham Young University. Mormons. Yeah. Latter-day Saints. Yeah. It's a Christian denomination that is really pro-family and very powerful in Utah. They're a very strong presence there. And they have a very interesting package of beliefs. Okay, let's talk about practical things. And I know most of you guys aren't in the dating/courtship phase of life, but you are. So just for your sake, we'll talk about this. I was converted to the faith at 19, and I went through a lot of heartbreak in high school, a lot of crazy stuff. Didn't know about Christian morality or embrace it. My parents really tried to get me to embrace it, but I wasn't converted, I didn't know Jesus, and so there was no real foundation for that. So I went through a lot of really difficult and damaging experiences, and then I became a Christian, decided I was going to follow God's plan. The ministry I was involved in was really into this thing they call courtship. Okay, when you say courtship to me, I think men in tights and women in pointed hats. So it was a new word to me. It's like courtship. Milady, may I this type of thing. But it was just a different way of approaching dating. So I went through this very strict courtship with the present husband that I have, and honestly, it was an overcorrection. People wanted to not do what people do in the world, where they date casually, get their heart broken, sometimes get sexually involved. They wanted to reject that, but then they overcorrected, and they put too many constraints. I don't know if you guys know what I'm talking about, but did any of you read Josh Harris's book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye? Okay, so some of you have had background and experience with that. I won't go too deep into that because not very many of you had that, but I've come to believe a little differently about courtship. I think it was an improvement on the way things were done before, but it was an overcorrection. So here's what I now propose, is that this formation of a partnership take place in 3 steps. Number 1, friendship dating. This is the part that was missing in the courtship model. You couldn't have anything to do with guys if you were a girl, or girls if you were a guy. You couldn't have any kind of dating or even conversations. It was very, very controlled. I remember running a health food store, and I was involved with this ministry, and they had a little health food store. I ran it. My husband came in. My present husband wasn't my husband at the time. He was just this gorgeous young man. So he came in, and he got some stuff, and he came up to the cash register, and I'm real nervous because you're not allowed to talk to boys very much. And he said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm okay." And he said, "I'm praying for you." And then he left. And that was like a bar line. It was like, in that context, it was like a bar line. I almost like swooned. He's praying for me, kind of thing. But it was too restrained. It was too controlled. And people, by being too controlled about sexuality, you can tacitly imply to people that they're animals and they can't control themselves. People should be able to go with a member of the opposite sex or to anyone that they're potentially attracted to, and have some kind of interaction with appropriate restraints in place. I would suggest going to a public place just for your own safety, especially if you don't know the person very well. Maybe having a friend somewhere within shouting distance, for your own safety. But you should be able to interact with these people and get to know a variety of them before you decide to get into serious dating. What happened with the courtship model is you went from not talking to guys at all to you're basically in a formal courtship, but you have to announce it to everyone. Those of you that have had exposure to courtship know what I'm talking about. And then it's almost like an engagement, because if your courtship breaks up, you failed. That was really the culture that was created. So that was too much, too soon, too fast. People need to get to know a variety of young people so that they can make an appropriate choice for someone to date seriously. And then once you're in that serious dating phase, thinking about engagement, which is what the serious dating is for in my thinking. You're not just dating to get involved emotionally and maybe physically and then go your separate ways. That's too risky. You can be too worried and you can be too risky. So you want to be careful. And so if you're seriously dating someone, you need to be thinking, is this an appropriate life partner? And asking those hard questions. And that's why I recommend that counseling take place at that phase rather than once people are engaged. Because if they're already engaged, they've sent out the invitations, they've told all their relatives, they've bought the dress, they've got the cake, and then it's like, we can't break up. All these people would be so disappointed and all that money will go down the drain. You know, so get the counseling and get all the issues out when you're dating still, before you engage, is my advice. And then the third phase, of course, is engagement, and that's a deeper commitment than a serious dating relationship. Do you think that's practical? All right, so again, there's this book that came out in 1995, I Kissed Dating Goodbye, that promoted the courtship model. It came from a very strong movement at the time in evangelicalism called the Purity Movement. There would be conferences where people would make a commitment to wait till marriage. They would make a commitment not to kiss anyone until they were married and all kinds of things, and they would wear purity rings. And it was this whole really very old covenant movement where people would make promises to God, and that was the center of their religious experience. It's kind of risky making the center of our religious experience our promises to God instead of his promises to us. And so the whole thing went flat after a while. But unfortunately, again, people overcorrected. So the man that wrote I Kissed Dating Goodbye, Joshua Harris, promoted this idea of courtship very broadly, but then ended up many years later renouncing it. He did a TED Talk pretty much renouncing it, and he ended up leaving his wife, and now he doesn't even call himself a Christian. Isn't that interesting? So I propose that we reposition purity. Here's the difference between what I think would be a good courtship model and a bad courtship model. Okay, a good courtship model, here's the things I want to hold on to. Waits till marriage for sex. Amen? Amen. A bad courtship model idolizes virginity. It makes too much out of something that is not as big as it makes it. A good courtship model includes loved ones in the process of coming to commit to a life partnership. You want the people that love you to advise you. That's usually a really good thing. In the old courtship model, fathers basically owned their daughters until a man came along and married them, and then the man kind of owned the daughters. And this is just basically a form of slavery, and that's not healthy. In the good courtship model, there is sexual restraint. In the bad courtship model, standards tended to be multiplied. You can't hold hands, you can't kiss, things that you can't really find in Scripture that really need to be the choice of the individuals. They kept multiplying those standards. The good courtship model avoids undue risk. The bad courtship model is pain avoidance. So what I mean by that is we want to avoid risk. We don't want to put ourselves in danger, in harm's way of getting our hearts broken. That's appropriate. But you can be so fear-based, so afraid of that you overprotect yourself. And really, there is some risk involved in finding a life partner that is, I think, unavoidable. So it was too risk avoidant in my thinking. The good courtship model protects vulnerable people, but the bad courtship model basically owns vulnerable people. So that's not healthy. It's like slavery. So that's what I would propose for appropriately correcting the overcorrection of the overcorrection that happened with the courtship movement. So here's some questions that I think people should ask. Number 1, am I ready for marriage? Number 2, are they ready for marriage? And number 3, are we compatible? So I want to just touch on that. Compatibility, hang on a second here. Okay, I'm going to talk about compatibility first. So I've used this little acronym. Acronyms are corny, but they're really helpful. Bring every concern to the table. Beliefs, enjoyment, values, and calling. Those are the 4 things that you look at. If your beliefs line up with that person, if your enjoyment, the things you like to do, somewhat line up with that person, not that you can't have separate pursuits, you can and should still be individuals, but you need to have some things that you enjoy together. If you have values in common, and then if you have a calling that coordinates with the other person's calling, if someone feels that they're called to Guadalajara to do mission work, to the riverboat people, and then somebody feels like he needs to be the next neurosurgeon at Mayo Clinic, it's probably not really very compatible because you're going to have to live in 2 different places. Make sense? So you want to make sure that your callings are compatible. How do you know if you're ready? I would point out these factors. Number 1, there should be no active addiction. in anyone's life who's thinking of marrying, because you're not functioning in your right mind when you're addicted to anything. So that active addiction needs to be taken care of. There should be no severe debt. Your debts should be resolved or nearly so, or you should have a really solid plan in place that would resolve those debts. You want to have resolved previous relationship baggage. Don't have your ex, still on your phone contact list and calling and texting regularly and all kinds of drama there. You can't do that. You bring that into the new relationship. You want to have your legal encumbrances largely resolved and basic relational maturity. And again, the best way to know that is, how'd you do in the friendship department? Do you have good, healthy, thriving friendships with people and mutual accountability and challenging one another, but also resolving conflict? All right, so let's stop there. And are there any questions or comments about what I've talked about so far? Go ahead.
I guess I see fathers as protecting their daughters, not holding them, and until they're under the protection of another. That was what worked well in my home, but
Yeah, there's something to that. I agree with you. It's a dangerous world out there, and men play a very protective role on the women and their family often, and that's a good thing and a godly thing. There's something called the stay-at-home daughter movement, where the daughters, until they're married, have to live at home. And they can't live independently of their parents and get a job and provide for themselves. It's an extreme. So that's what I'm talking about when I say the father's owning the daughters instead of protecting them. Protection is good. Owning is not. There's a line. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Anybody else? How you guys doing? Is this boring? No? Okay. I'm glad you're here. I hope you are too. Okay, we got some hands.
Thank you so much for sharing that information about the courtship.
Yeah.
Because, of course, we have young
Yeah.
young adult children that have not gotten to the age of actually, dating and stuff like that. But I had heard of a certain group of people that recommend that you don't even talk to the opposite sex at, this young age, like you were saying, this courtship thing. And I thought, well, how could that be healthy? Because how do you really get to know people if you never get to really talk to them and stuff like that? So I would always encourage my young people that go out in groups so that you can really see that person and their personality and what they're like in the group, so that you would know, is that somebody that I really want to get close to or not? So thank you for sharing the difference between that courtship and what we could possibly do now and encourage our young people to do.
Yeah, I really appreciate that comment. Thank you for that. Going out in groups is really great. Like the ministry activity you have this afternoon is a great example of things that happen abundantly in a church context. If the church is active socially and in ministry and evangelistically, you're going to have a lot of those kind of activities where kids can be together. I would say also, to me, it would be appropriate to go out as two alone, but try to be in a public place versus very alone, private. Walking a beach, a public eating place, I think that those are okay too. Go ahead.
In the relationship, where do you put compatibility, the importance of compatibility on a scale of 1 to 10, honestly?
Yeah.
People are thinking about getting married.
I know.
Where do you put that?
It's so hard to figure out. I worked very long and hard on that slide just to say what really does constitute deal breakers in compatibility. These are the only things I come up with. I don't think any of the personality tests are right. I think they're all wrong. That if people aren't compatible in their personalities, they're going to figure that out when they're dating, and that's why they need to date and spend some time together and be with groups, like you said, so they figure out, do I even like this person? So that's going to come out. And to try to take a personality test, oh, you're an ENFP and I'm an INFJ, we should get married. That's just, I don't know. I don't think anybody has figured out personality to that level. And it's amazing how God has built so much resiliency into the married relationship that people can find compatibility even though they're vastly different. I don't know a more introverted person than my husband. I'm not an introvert. I'm more of an extrovert. We make it work. You work it out. You know, it's amazing what you can do with what you have.
Yes,
Yeah.
compatibility. What about if a couple, they're dating, they're courting, and they find they have the same beliefs, enjoyment, values, and calling, but one of them is emotionally immature, maybe something like we talked last night, but didn't have that upbringing. What would you counsel a couple like that? Would you counsel them to wait? Would you take a time out to allow the other person to grow? What, in that instance, what would you counsel?
I think it would depend on the severity of the immaturity problem and the trajectory of that person's life. Are they just at the beginning of a climb toward maturity? Are they capitalizing on all the opportunities they have to grow? Maybe they had some setbacks as a child that they're now compensating for. It's a little steeper climb for them. But are they really motivated and trying and really engaged? I would ask those kinds of questions, and I have to judge that on an individual basis. But at this point, just on the face value, I'd say, wait a while until that person has grown up, or you can see if they're going to grow up or not, maybe a year. It doesn't have to be forever. You can tell a lot within a year.
Thank you. That
Sure,
sounds great.
sure. Good point, though. Yeah.
What advices do you have for people who have long-distance relationships? That you have little times to like spend time together as a family, hanging out.
Yeah. It's hard. I mean, we're having more and more of that because of online dating apps and so forth. A friend of mine started something called Love Potluck, where it's a speed dating thing, and people show up and they do like speed dating online, and it's working. I know a couple. I was just at a wedding of someone that met on that app, so we're doing a lot of that these days, and you really can't get around it, especially during COVID when you're restricted in the amount of physical involvement. But it is really difficult to pull off a long-distance relationship. You might think about moving closer, but then if you're not at that point of commitment, it's hard to be like, I'm moving to your town. And the person's like, what? I'm not ready for, so it's really a delicate thing, but I don't, like, whoever it is, have they met the person? And they have met the person and been around them substantially previous to the long distance? Okay, so as long as you like that person's physical presence, I think it probably could be done, but you need to make sure it's punctuated with a lot of visits and a lot of opportunities to be together, particularly with other people. But I think it can be done. I'll tell you a story of when it didn't work out. A very dear loved one of mine was writing a guy for a long time, and he was a missionary in China. And he literally came over on the boat to meet her, and as soon as he walked in the door, she said, I can't do this. I don't know what it was. He looked fine in pictures. He was not a bad-looking person, but she was athletic and strong, and he was very tiny, and it just didn't work. And it was hurtful and painful because they probably had built it up in their minds, And so it's really important that you actually see the person, and you could be physically attracted to that person and like being around them.
I don't know how to, when we're talking about dating, are you, she's like, I want it right up in the mouth. We're under the assumption that dating is with mature adults.
Yeah,
Okay.
somewhat. Nobody's really
How much
mature.
study has been done with these middle-aged kids in middle school claiming to going on dates and dating someone? She's like, I didn't even know that was happening.
All right, so you're saying how much research has been done on,
Yeah, because we have like a young man, and
Was here
at
last
12 years old, he was
Yeah.
coming home saying he's dating someone, and we're like, what do you mean by dating? And he couldn't define it, but they're in this middle school talking about dating, and it's kind of blown my.
Well, what does that mean to him?
He
I would ask
doesn't
him to
know.
define
He
it.
doesn't know. He's
So
like,
what
so
if-
we're like hanging out with each other.
It
and
probably
stuff.
means they eat lunch together in the cafeteria. Because they can't drive,
Right.
so he's not like going off with her.
Right.
Maybe they walk around the school parking lot.
Yeah,
I would
because
ask
in
him
my
to-
mind of dating, it's like you're kissing, you're snuggling, you're getting, and I'm like, whoa.
Yeah, yeah. I get you. I think dating is used in a much more loose way than it used to be. Dating used to be going out on dates, and now it means that's my boyfriend. And that can be, we pass notes to each other in science class, in 4th grade science class, or it can mean, and it's used also for being sexually active with someone. And that's terrifying. I know. Like, talk about it. I know. We'll pray for your young man. Yes? Okay.
Hi, thank you so much, Jennifer,
Sure.
for this weekend.
Yeah.
I have a question about the elephant in the room, and that is how highly sexually charged men are. And when you give advice about staying pure until marriage, all of us women understand that. We understand that, and we have, many of us have figured that out. But I just wondered if you know of any books that have been written by mature men who have been successful at this, who can give practical advice to young men. Because young people, I'm a lot older than I look. I'm in my 50s, but I do know that young men and women, but mostly the young men in their teens and in their 20s in the church are, maybe not this church, but generally in Adventism, extremely sexually active.
I know.
And they're just built differently. And what are they supposed to do with all of that?
Yeah, you make a very good point. The higher levels of testosterone, of course, increase sex drive, and they have to be metabolized, particularly in young male bodies. There's a very interesting statement in the writings of Ellen White. She says that particularly young men should have stern, severe exercise. She uses those two adjectives, stern and severe. Extreme exercise. And that is the key to controlling those hormones that will make it possible for a young man to contain himself, I think. And of course, relying on the Holy Spirit and God, and just, another statement, the mind soon ceases to desire what it knows it cannot have. So if young men are telling themselves, I can't help myself, I'm not capable of containing myself, they're going to open a door to compromise. If they tell themselves, God requires me to contain myself, it is possible through the grace of God to contain myself, and I'm going to do everything I can to align myself with that plan, then their mind will soon cease to desire what it knows it cannot have. So a lot of this has to do with the decision of the will, but I think to have mercy on young men who are testosterone loaded, and so are young women to a degree, but not the same degree, men particularly need stern, severe exercise. I don't know a better way to do that than
Get away from Nintendo.
get off of your devices and get out and start landscaping your yard, grow a garden. Sports have their place, but I would recommend some manual labor besides just all sports, because sports have their own set of psychological things that can sometimes make men more driven and more animal-like. So I would suggest, I'm sorry, but it's true, I'm not totally against sports. I think there's a place for play, but I think it's really good for young men to do something of value with their hands and, landscape their yard, go out and rake people's lawns. Hey, Grandma, it looks like you need some stuff done. Can I help you? Be a champion. You can use that strength to bless a lot of, you can come to my house and bless a lot of people. I have actually 4 young men that rent rooms for me upstairs because my husband and I live in an apartment. And the other day we put in a pool, an above-ground pool, and we had this stair that we had to put over the wall of the pool. And these kids were outside, and I was like, okay, we're going to do this now. And one of them was like, I called them Samson and Goliath. And the 2 of them lifted that thing up and put it in the pool, and it was very heavy. But I knew that I could get them to do that. I was like, you can do this. They were like, and they put it. Young men need challenges, and they need physical challenges, and they can be such a blessing to people with that strength. So find ways to use it. Get off your Nintendo. Amen. And then you had a...
Hi, good morning.
Yeah.
In light of what the sister just said, I think as a teenager, my mom realized that my testosterone were all over the place. So she got me this book called Unbecoming a Man.
Good.
And
Who is
it
it
really,
by?
really worked. It was really, really good. I
What-
can't remember who wrote
you
it,
don't- okay.
but it's called On Becoming a Man.
Yeah.
Now, having said that, I do believe in dating and getting to know each other, spending time with one another
Right.
to get to know who they are. However, in today's society, we know that the marriage relation has been a mess.
Yeah.
And spending time together, too much time together alone,
Yeah.
there's going to be some chemistry development.
It's true.
And things are going to happen. It's automatic. I'm going to shorten it. How would you rate the marriage of Isaac and Rebecca having never met each other compared to today's world?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And Isaac and Rebecca is the courtship model of the Old Testament, and in many ways it's an ideal model. But we don't have arranged marriages today, so it is a bit different. I'm not saying to spend a lot of time together alone in private with a member of the opposite sex. I think you have to be careful with that. But I'm encouraging people to get to know a variety of people. Isaac and Rebecca were part of a family system where they knew people within, they knew her character, they knew his character. When you meet someone online or at GYC or something once, you need to know that person's background before you start. So there are some protections in place when you have two families arranging a marriage that you don't have today. So I would be careful to tell people, just to marry someone they don't know. That would be too risky. But you're absolutely right that we do need to be restrained and careful, and we probably need to end Sabbath school. Sorry, guys. Sure.